Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the Poison Pen to meet Bruce Borgos for the second time because he was here for the Bitter Past originally. Thank you, virtual audience, for watching this. And the reason that we're doing this afternoon and not last night when it was scheduled was that Bruce had an unfortunate airline experience.
Which is very common.
Yep. But we are salvaging it because he had another one this morning, which means he couldn't leave when he was supposed to. So here we are, able
Strange luck.
I know, recapture it. So let's go back for a moment and talk about The Bitter Past, which was your first book that came out last year and has been super well received, certainly by me, but by lots of other discerning readers. And your path to publication, you've had like a couple of books that were, independently published or something?
Yeah, I self-published my first two novels, really just to kind of see if that was something I could really do, if I had the chops to actually write a story. So,
and it's not uncommon for the first published book to not be the first book that an author has written.
Right.
So the concept of The Bitter Past was extremely complicated. I was very impressed that as a first novelist, you were able to juggle all those plot lines. And there was, there was a really big reveal at the end. How did you go about doing this? How did you structure the book?
Well, it was interesting because the story is really, this is really embarrassing.
No, it's not. Probably the airline.
It's my wife. The story takes place in the desert of Nevada, about 75 miles north of Las Vegas. And that area has always fascinated me because it's where, I know you ladies are too young to remember this, but in the 1950s, we were testing all of the above-ground atomic weapons out in the desert. And all of that radiation subsequently blew east and south and kind of eventually all over the United States and beyond. But so I was fascinated by that era of time that all of that was taking place. And I wanted to write a story I knew, but I didn't want to write a nonfiction story because you can go to there's plenty of great history books about that era. So I decided I needed to tie that period to the present in order to make it relatable to especially younger readers who might not, be historians. And I knew I needed to come up with some good way to tie those two pieces together. So I created a fictional sheriff in Lincoln County who's got some unique abilities and some unique history. And the book opens with him trying to solve the murder of a retired FBI agent. And all of that, his investigation, leads him back to the hunt for a Soviet spy in the 1950s who was trying to infiltrate the atomic weapons program out in the desert there. So, yeah, there were a lot of balls I was kind of juggling in the air and trying to fit all those pieces together. And it wasn't really easy, but I had a lot of great help. I had a lot of great research help. I was trying to make sure that I captured everything in the past correctly. So it worked out.
It did work out. I love the idea of a spy story set in Las Vegas. I mean, right there. Entirely credibly, I think, when we got to the end of it. It was very believable. There was a movie made in this area with John Wayne and Susan Hayward. I'm trying to remember the rest of the cast.
Yeah.
And everyone involved in that movie in that 50-something, they all died of cancer. Yeah, John Wayne died of cancer. Susan Hayward died of cancer. There were many extras. There were a number of Native Americans involved because it was some kind of, John Wayne Western or whatever. And that's been, so there've been reparations paid and all, but it was civilian testing and therefore not unreasonable for the Russians to have sent somebody to try to penetrate the very fenced off, very security, conscious facility there.
Right.
And the way you tied it, I don't want to do a spoiler, but the way that Bruce successfully tied this to the present and to Sheriff Beck is remarkable. There's also a really great love story in it, which you forgot to mention, but the love story is wonderful.
Were there a lot of people that lived in that area that died of cancer beside these Hollywood stars?
Well, the area that was directly east of the Nevada test site um, was it's somewhat rural. It still is. I mean, there are some fairly large towns and cities there now, but the government would not detonate one of those bombs unless the wind was blowing the right way, and the right way was towards Utah, because there wasn't a lot of people. If it was blowing towards like Las Vegas, which was actually even closer, they wouldn't set it off. So those poor, unfortunate folks, many of whom I interviewed for the book, they never saw it coming. And of course, at that time, you have to remember, we didn't know what we didn't know about radiation. And it was a different era. I talked to a lot of those people and who had survived, at least some of them actually have died since I interviewed them. And they said almost to a person that, well, it was the patriotic, we didn't complain too much because we were in a war with the Soviet Union. It was a Cold War, but it was a war. And that was, that was kind of the price of admission, and they kind of were brought up that way. So eventually, as Barbara alluded to, there's been reparations and payouts from the government to people who've lived downwind.
I often think about that with Putin's threat of nuclear war, and I say to people often, he keeps forgetting the wind blows east. Yeah. It's going to blow right towards China and India, and I think that the Chinese would have a real problem with him detonating,
Right.
nuclear stuff into the air, because the air patterns, in fact, go that direction. So, for more or less, if you are like a C.J. Box reader or Craig Johnson, what you get here is a really great Western thriller, along with a police procedural, i.e. the sheriff, along with a spy story, which is a very unusual structure. So if you missed A Bitter Past, which was one of our first mystery selections last year, I have ascertained that we can still get first printings of the hardcover, and Bruce has agreed to let us ship them to him. And so I think myself that it's way better, especially with only a second book, if you read the first book and then you read the second book, because there's stuff that will be forever spoiled if you, the personal relations, not the mystery itself, but the problem with reading a second book first is that the personal stuff, the people that you met, you will know how some of those personal dilemmas have resolved and who survived the first book. So you can go with the paperback, or you can order, I'm talking to the virtual audience here, or as much, you can order the hardcover. So I was worried, because it was such a great book, I was really apprehensive about opening the new book, because oftentimes, if you loved a book, you worry that the second one won't live up to it.
I did too.
And the truth is, historically, second novels are the hardest novels for an author to write and an author to have well received, especially if a first book has done extremely well. There's always that, worry that it'll be a letdown. And I'm happy to report that the second book is just as good as the first book. It's just amazing in point of fact. And once again, great surprises in it. So what we have is another dramatic opening scene involving the U.S. military and drones and hacking. And so tell us about the prologue, because the prologue really pulls you in.
Yeah, it's, again, the Nevada desert, a lot of people don't know this, about 80% of all the land in Nevada is still owned by the federal government. And much of that is, as Barbara said, fenced off, highly guarded, very secret. We've all heard about Area 51, and that happens to be right next door to where my sheriff lives, and all sorts of strange things happening out there that really happen. There's all sorts of crazy stuff going on out there, and crazy people who want to see what's going on out there. So I wanted to write a little bit about technology and some of the technology that really scares me. And it's funny that we're talking about this. I'm sitting right here, and I see this book down on the bottom shelf right there, and it's called This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. It's written by a lady by the name of Nicole Perlroth, who's a New York Times reporter for technology. And I read her book, and I couldn't sleep after that, because it's all about how things like all of these different hacking things take place. Things called 0 days, where that software vulnerabilities are discovered and sold on the open market, and exploited in a lot of cases. We hear about ransomware attacks and things like that. We also have now all sorts of artificial intelligence and automated aircraft and things like that are happening. The military is using. And some of this stuff is, we really don't, all of us, don't have a great understanding of most of what is happening there. And there are lots of cases now that a lot of that stuff has not worked according to plan, where things like drones or driverless vehicles have been hacked because they're all computers on wheels or computers with wings.
Actually, driverless vehicles had become a murder weapon. Was it Kathy Reich? I'm trying to remember. I think it was Kathy Reich's last book. In the end, one of the people, I won't tell you who, so no spoiler here, but one of the killings in the book is because somebody hacks the car and drives it over a cliff.
Right.
And locks the doors. So, guy can't get out. And I think about that when my car is basically a computer, right? They are today. But I thought that's really creative. You noticed all the Waymo cars? Yeah. I mean, they're all over. No, I have a Mercedes, just a regular 2014 Mercedes, which I'm never going to. I don't.
I don't know. They might be able to some extent.
Maybe some of it. I don't know. Right. Fortunately, we don't have many cliffs here that I could be driven over. But still, what I thought was it was interesting that because of this, we have a new murder weapon that, 20 years ago, nobody would have thought of taking out it was a bad actor, taking out one of the bad actors by basically hijacking the car and, sending him over a cliff. Well, but here's the challenge for a thriller writer or any writer is that the technology is constantly presenting you with things you have to overcome. I mean, people have cell phones, so you can be tracked, and so police, if you're doing an investigation and so forth, you have to account for technology. You have to geolocation, all that other stuff.
All of it
makes it harder and harder to write thrillers unless there's a way you can adapt a lot of this technology into it. Remember CJ he used a wind turbine to kill somebody.
Yes.
He actually sent some, the
that was
victim is strapped to one of the windmill, things. And but I mean,
it's a
all
great
I'm
scene,
saying,
though.
it's a great scene.
Yeah.
But my point is that, if you can incorporate this new technology, then it gives your book an immediacy. And that's what you did in this book because of the drone, because somebody hijacks the drone. And the next thing you know, this is the first 2 pages, so no spoiler. The next thing you know, the drone is descending towards a birthday party with lots of kids on a ranch. And you go, whatever. That's the cliffhanger.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean,
but then the question is, for the reader, after you read the first 2 or 3 pages, the question is, did all those kids die, or what actually happened next? And that makes you want to continue the book, right?
Yeah.
Well done, Bruce.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah.
So that's Shades of Mercy.
That's this
And
book.
as Barbara said, so the story really revolves around a teenage girl who's probably one of the best hackers in the world. And she's currently incarcerated at the youth center in Lincoln County. With a bunch of other kids who are primarily there on drug charges and things like that. But nobody really knows who this girl is or really why she's there. So there's a lot more there to her that meets the eye. And my sheriff, Porter Beck, kind of recognizes instantly when he first meets her that there's something's wrong here with this girl. And a lot of the story revolves around him trying to figure that out. And also figure out why there's a lot of other people and governments who are interested in who she is.
It's so great, to be a hacker, you almost have to be like 12 anymore. I mean, this is where, and it reminds me of, it's like the young Mozart. Nobody, there he was, 6 years old, writing,
exactly.
incredible
Prodigies.
music and all.
Yeah.
And it does seem that in literature, certainly in crime fiction, so often that hackers are really young.
Yep.
Often completely unable to cope with anything besides computers. They have few social skills. They often are, maybe have OCD or some kind of autism or some, what would be a social disability, but is not a disability if in fact your whole world is computers.
Exactly.
So it almost becomes a stock character, and because of that, to handle one that in a fresh way, and it's not just like, oh, here's another hacker. I thought you did a really good job with that. Mercy, isn't that her name?
Mercy.
Yeah.
Mercy Vaughn. Yeah.
Mercy's a really interesting, and yep. And so part of the question is, is who's playing who? Is Mercy, right? It's okay. Is Mercy being played, or are they playing Mercy?
Exactly.
Huh? I'm not going to tell
Yeah.
you. But I'm just saying.
But
that,
yeah, it's,
but that's another reason that I think that Bruce's books are so interesting, is he doesn't fall. It looks as though it could be a another trope, so to speak, or just another thing, but he doesn't do that to us. He always takes us in some direction that you're not really expecting. I mean, I'm 70 some years into reading crime fiction, so it's God, I really am. That's
Wow.
really frightening. I'm going to be 84. Well, thank you, but I am right, almost. But my point is, I've been reading. I have read my way through all of this stuff, and it's hard to surprise me.
And that's the real challenge I find for myself in writing. Is somebody asked me this question, I think last week. They said, how do you make sure that you surprise your reader? And quite honestly, I sit there at the computer oftentimes thinking, like, for me, and I'm like a lot of writers who kind of plan everything out ahead of time. I do a very deep outline of the story.
That was a question.
So
okay.
I think, at least in my mind, I have an idea of, okay, where am I going from start to finish? But in doing that, I start going through that, and I go, okay, well, where are my surprises? I have to have some twists and turns along the way here. It can't be obvious. None of it can be obvious if you really want to keep the reader going. So as you guys know, you read something and you're like, oh, that's, I didn't see that coming. That's what you're hoping for as a writer. It's not easy to do.
No. Sometimes I think that a writer like Bruce could actually have had a very successful career as a career criminal, but because you have to think that way in order to
For you
write
law
it.
enforcement people who are watching,
Right.
just ignore that.
No, it's really true. I remember I gave the eulogy at a funeral for an author, from Poison Pen Press, and I said that, and everybody sort of leapt up. And I said, if Fred, hadn't he actually was a minister. I said, if Fred hadn't gotten religion and gone into the church, I said he could have been a very successful career criminal. And the whole place went, really? But it's true, because he did think like a career criminal.
Yeah. I think
So
there's a lot of
interesting.
parallels actually to the mindset.
Yep.
So
Right. You can't
yeah,
make this stuff up if you can't think it up.
that's exactly right.
Nope.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Well, we're glad you're on the straight and narrow.
We are, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. For all intents and purposes. I mean,
So the good news is that, like many new writers, Bruce got a contract for 2 books. That's kind of normal. Sometimes it's only 1 book, but it actually doesn't pay a publisher to just publish 1 book as a rule. So usually it's 2. But the good news is, it's now been extended to 4 books. So I'm really excited about that.
yeah.
I'm assuming that they are, but I could be wrong. They're going to all be Porter Beck.
They are.
Okay,
Yeah.
because sometimes these contracts mean that they have to write 1 book in a series, and then they can write something completely different. But I'm hoping, because I think Porter Publishing really wants books like this. What they really want is they want it to be the same but different. That's kind of the same.
That's exactly right.
They want every Jack Reacher to be the same but different.
Right.
And so far, you have succeeded with book 2.
Yeah, I'm getting
in
nervous
being the
about book
same
3.
but different. So the pressure is on. Yep.
So there'll be at least 4 in this series, and if they keep
Right.
doing well, we'll see where that goes.
Right.
But
Or you might decide to write something
yeah,
else. But
yeah.
yeah, but at least we're going to get 4 of this Porter Beck thing, and I'm delighted.
How did you find a publisher? You said you self-published the first two.
Yes. So after I did that, I really felt when I was writing this 3rd one that, okay, I think I'm good enough to take this out and see if I can get a traditional publisher. Now, as Barbara will tell you, the trick to getting a traditional publisher is you have to be represented typically by a literary agent. And that's the really hard thing because it's a super competitive thing that you have to get into. And so what I did was I researched as much as I could about the ins and outs of getting an agent. I studied that before I even approached any of them. And I was very fortunate. I think a lot of it probably was luck that I was in the right place at the right time. And I found an agent who decided to read my manuscript because I had simply used a private editor that she had worked with before. So there was a connection there. And sometimes that's the in that you get. But, I had to kind of research all of that to figure that out. So
In the publisher's company, there's an editor. They edited your book. Do they change?
yes.
Do they change a lot of it?
They change, they suggest changes here and there. My editor is very good at, and Barbara knows him very well, he's very good at making suggestions about things. He doesn't ever push me to make changes, really, at least he hasn't so far. But generally, I find that I agree almost across the board with all of his suggestions. I read his red lines and I go, God, that makes perfect sense. I wish I'd thought of that. So he's very good at it.
But does he change the storyline
No.
a little bit, or no? It's
No.
just, like corrections of.
No, just minor tweaks here and there. Taking certain sections, maybe I delete a section or I move chapters around timing wise.
Maybe you repeated yourself,
Right.
which happens a
Oh yeah,
lot.
which really point
Oftentimes,
out, yeah.
editing is really just about removing repetition. But occasionally, what's clear in the author's head doesn't get down on the page. And so sometimes it's a question of saying to the author, there's too little here. What did you actually mean by that?
Exactly.
But they don't generally change the storyline.
Yeah.
No. He's a wonderful editor. He's a very dear friend, and I'm extremely fond of him. And he once upon a time, was a bookseller.
Yeah.
Yay.
So what
Right.
was your publisher?
So it's Minotaur Books, which is an imprint of
Macmillan.
which is one of the, I think, what is it? Is it down to 4 now or is it 5?
No, there's still 5. Most of the big publishers have several imprints. So the big fantasy company, Tor, is part of Macmillan. Flatiron Books.
Penguin a biggie?
Penguin is part of Random House. It's an imprint over at Penguin Random House.
What is an imprint?
It means that a big publisher is an amalgamation of several smaller acquisition and production, and some of them, they used to be fairly distinct in their personalities, but that's gone now, and generally, yeah.
Yeah.
Mystery writers love stories.
Well, Minotaur, as an imprint of Macmillan, is mystery. They are very specific, but that is not, in general, how it works out. Most of them are kind of... There are smaller publishers that might specialize, for example, in memoirs. Bob Parsons, we did an event for Bob, our local billionaire, that sold GoDaddy for whatever, and we did an event for him in May. It was several, actually, events for him in May. He did. It's a memoir. It's right around the corner there. But in any case, this particular small publisher, that's what they do. They do memoirs, and they have a ghostwriter, or not a ghostwriter, but somebody that works with the memoir. But they are a division of Simon & Schuster, or they're imprint of Simon & Schuster, or maybe they're just a distribution client. I never remember. But anyway, so these big publishers are basically kind of amalgamators of a number of smaller ones. But back when I started the store in 1989, there were a lot of small publishers, and they had much more distinctive personalities. Penguin was largely a British company, and so much of the books that they did came from the UK. They did a lot of classics. They did, that was kind of their line, but that's not really true anymore. Whatever.
It's not true anymore?
No, not really.
Yeah, I mean, it's like any other business, really, or industry. The bigger guys tend to swallow the smaller ones.
Yeah,
So
it's
that's what
just,
happens.
but we're trending in a way because they got so big, and because it is so hard for an author to break into those companies, and because the technology allows the production and printing of books, because there are freelance editors and freelance publishers, and I don't mean freelance publicists
Right.
and other things that there are many now avenues to publication that didn't exist 10 years ago. Technology has assisted that. The problem is that if you actually want to make a living as a writer, it's really only the big companies that can afford to pay you enough money for that. But if you just want to be a writer and you keep
Sure.
your day job and all, there's
Yeah.
almost an infinite number of paths to publication at this point. So I think that we're going to see a whole sort of, it's like after a forest fire when there's like 7 big trees standing, but then all the new stuff gets to grow up.
Right.
I think that that's what we're seeing is all these little seedlings, are going to
Yeah.
grow up to be bigger. And, it's kind of a repetitious cycle.
Yeah,
We'll
and it's
see.
really become an industry unto itself about how to publish your own book.
Yeah.
As Barbara said, there's so many avenues now to do that, so many ways to do that, and this industry has built up around how to do this. There's all these how-to books.
Well, there are.
Yeah.
So, for me as a bookseller, you don't want to come in here and just find the same books that, you're going to see at Barnes & Noble on a table. So my job is to find all kinds of books that you aren't going to find in other bookstores. So there are British imports here, there are small press books here, there are just all kinds of things that you wouldn't see anywhere but in our bookstore.
Well, one of our relatives, she's young, she's into publishing, but she did it all on the internet. People put
Sure.
stuff on the internet.
That's right.
And her job was to go on, and I think it was children's, I'm not sure exactly what genre she was into, but to find somebody that she liked. And then,
But that's the problem. It's such a crowded marketplace that to
Yes.
connect with a reader, for an author to connect with a reader, regardless of your road to publication, is really a challenge. So anyway, thank you, Bruce. It's
Oh,
wonderful
thank
to
you so
see
much
you
for
again.
having me, and I'm so sorry I couldn't be here last
It's
night.
not your fault. You know,
know.
You-
well, hopefully a better flight.
he could actually have driven here faster.
Oh, I could have, because
than
I
he
live in
could've-
Las Vegas, so
That's
I
right. It
I
was-
could have been
you
down
know,
here in
I
about
kept
4.5
getting
hours.
updates from Bruce. I'm still on the plane.
Oh, my
We're still
gosh.
on the runway.
Vegas and the wind going there.
Yeah.
I
Right.
would not have gone to Vegas.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are watching, because we'll be on YouTube, we are in fact shortly going to be on YouTube and Facebook and all. We still have autographed copies of Shades of Mercy, and we have the paperback. But
One bought two, both of them.
at a girl, we're going to ship the hardcover of A Bitter Feast. Thank you. Sorry, there's just so many books in my head. Hardcover of The Bitter Feast to Bruce. So if you'd like one in the next 2 or 3 days, if you wanted to order one on our website, which is easy to do, then we can include you in that shipment. So I'm glad it worked out that you could come back and
I'm
see
so
us.
glad. And it's always great to be here, even though this is only my second time. But I'm going to be coming back, hopefully, as the next few books come out.
Have another book.
Yeah.
Well, let us know.
Well, I'm on the air. I'm on the 12-month cycle. So
Right.
hopefully the next one comes out.
Unfortunately, July, if you ladies sign up for our newsletter and I
Yeah.
write to you, then in that case you will know when he's coming back. There's also the occasional guest host opportunity.
Yeah.
So sometimes, because we do so many of these events, I invite authors like Bruce to come in and talk to another author, so it isn't always me all the time, which can be really boring. Anyway, thank you very much, virtual audience. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you all
Thank
for
you,
coming.
Barbara.